The year was 1965, a time when the American military machine arrived in Southeast Asia with absolute confidence in its technological supremacy. We brought roaring helicopters that darkened the skies, heavy artillery that could flatten entire coordinates, and chemical defoliants designed to strip the enemy of their natural camouflage. I am Sergeant Thomas Miller, and I led my squad into the Iron Triangle, fully expecting our overwhelming firepower to secure a swift victory. Instead, we were swallowed whole by an ancient, unforgiving canopy that rendered our modern weapons completely useless against a phantom enemy. The physical environment of the Vietnamese jungle was our first and perhaps most relentless. Every step we took was an exhausting battle against suffocating humidity, aggressive swarms of insects, and a dense undergrowth that tore at our uniforms and flesh. The temperature hovered near 100 degrees, turning our combat gear into heavy, sweat-soaked burdens that drained our stamina rapidly. We were trained to fight conventional armies on open battlefields, not to navigate a claustrophobic green labyrinth where visibility was often reduced to less than 10 agonizingly tense meters. Among my men was Private William Davis, a fresh recruit from Ohio who represented the typical infantryman deployed during this escalation phase. Davis was barely 19, wide-eyed, and completely unprepared for the psychological warfare that awaited us beneath the dense canopy. He carried his heavy rifle with nervous energy, his eyes constantly darting around the impenetrable foliage, searching for a target he could never see. I watched him wipe sweat from his brow, his hands trembling slightly, as I told him to keep his spacing tight and his eyes glued to the muddy ground ahead. The tactical reality of the Vietnam War was fundamentally different from the grand campaigns of the Second World War. The Viet Cong, or Charlie as we called them, rarely engaged us in direct, prolonged firefights where our artillery could destroy them. They were masters of terrain and patience, utilizing a vast network of subterranean tunnels and guerrilla tactics to strike quickly before vanishing into the earth. This evasion strategy created a pervasive sense of paranoia among our ranks, as we were constantly marching through hostile territory without ever encountering a visible, tangible opposing force to fight. Rumors began to circulate among the platoons long before we experienced the grim reality of the indigenous defensive systems. Veteran soldiers shared hushed, terrifying stories about hidden snares, tripwires attached to artillery shells, and pits filled with sharpened bamboo stakes. These whispered tales eroded our morale faster than any mortar barrage, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of young soldiers like Davis. The earth beneath our boots, which should have been firm and reliable, transformed into a psychological minefield where a single misstep could result in agonizing mutilation or a slow, agonizing death. The jungle floor itself was a chaotic tapestry of decaying vegetation, twisted roots, and treacherous mud, making threat detection nearly impossible. Sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting long, deceptive shadows that played tricks on our exhausted minds during long patrols. Every pile of dead leaves, every seemingly natural depression in the soil, and every broken branch had to be scrutinized with extreme prejudice. This hypervigilance was mentally draining, forcing soldiers to walk with a stilted, hesitant gait as they probed the ground ahead with the tips of their bayonets or sturdy walking sticks. During one particularly grueling afternoon patrol, I noticed Davis drifting dangerously close to the edge of the narrow trail. I immediately grabbed his shoulder harness, pulling him back toward the center while whispering sharply, "Stay off the soft vegetation, son. Charlie always anticipates our natural inclination to seek easier walking paths." Davis nodded vigorously, his face pale and slick with sweat, stammering, "I'm sorry, Sergeant. I just lost focus for a second," while clutching his rifle tighter. It was clear that the constant fear of the unseen was already gnawing at his psychological resilience. We were beginning to understand that these rudimentary traps were not necessarily designed to inflict immediate, lethal casualties upon our forces. From a purely tactical perspective, a dead soldier requires only a body bag, but a severely wounded soldier demands immediate medical evacuation, effectively removing several healthy men from the combat formation to assist him. This doctrine of attrition was brilliant in its cruel simplicity, leveraging our own compassion and logistical requirements against us. The guerrilla fighters knew that bleeding our resources and halting our momentum was far more effective than engaging us directly. The most infamous and psychologically devastating weapon in the guerrilla arsenal was undoubtedly the punji stick, an ancient hunting mechanism repurposed for modern asymmetric warfare. These were not complex explosive devices requiring industrial manufacturing. They were simply pieces of local bamboo, hardened by fire and sharpened to a razor-like point. Their production cost was virtually zero, requiring only manual labor and natural materials readily available throughout the dense Vietnamese countryside. Yet, these primitive wooden stakes possessed the terrifying ability to neutralize fully equipped American combat infantrymen wearing boots designed by the world's greatest military superpower. As we pushed deeper into a suspected Viet Cong staging area, the ambient noises of the jungle abruptly ceased, creating an oppressive, unnatural silence. The birds stopped singing, and the constant hum of insects vanished, a classic indicator that we were entering a highly contested or actively monitored zone. I signaled the squad to halt, dropping to one knee and raising a clenched fist as my eyes desperately scanned the impenetrable wall of green surrounding us. The tension in the humid air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a combat knife, as we waited for an ambush. Our heavy combat boots, which were supposed to provide protection and stability, felt remarkably clumsy and inadequate against the subtle dangers of the jungle floor. We were carrying roughly 60 pounds of equipment each, including extra ammunition, canteens of water, medical supplies, and standard-issue entrenching tools. This massive physical burden meant that any loss of balance or sudden misstep would result in a heavily weighted plunge downward, amplifying the kinetic force of a fall. The Viet Cong engineers understood this physics principle perfectly, designing their hidden pits to maximize the gravitational pull of a heavily laden American soldier. After 10 minutes of agonizing stillness, I gave the hand signal to resume our forward movement, maintaining a deliberate and agonizingly slow pace. We stepped carefully in the footprints of the man directly ahead, trusting the point man to identify any subtle disturbances in the soil or unnatural arrangements of foliage. This single-file formation made us highly vulnerable to a flanking maneuver, but it was the only practical way to minimize the risk of triggering subsurface hazards. Every breath felt forced, and the metallic clinking of our gear seemed deafeningly loud against the quiet backdrop of the hostile forest. The responsibility resting on the shoulders of the point man was immense, requiring intense concentration that could only be maintained for short durations before severe mental fatigue set in. He was the tip of the spear, the human tripwire who was statistically the most likely to encounter a hidden punji pit or an explosive booby trap first. I watched our point man meticulously probe a suspicious patch of discolored dirt with his bayonet, his shoulders tense and his movements incredibly precise. When he finally signaled the all clear, a collective, silent sigh of relief rippled down the entire patrol line. Davis was positioned fourth in the column, struggling noticeably to maintain the delicate balance between scanning the tree line for snipers and watching the ground for traps. He was exhausted, his uniform completely saturated with sweat, and his combat boots coated in a thick layer of slippery, reddish-brown clay. I could hear his labored breathing over the rhythmic squelch of our footsteps, a clear sign that the oppressive heat and intense psychological stress were rapidly depleting his energy reserves. I quietly instructed him to drink some water, emphasizing the importance of staying hydrated to maintain cognitive focus. This environment fundamentally altered our perception of combat, forcing us to view the very earth we walked upon as an active, malicious participant in the war. In previous conflicts, a soldier could seek refuge by diving to the ground during an incoming artillery barrage or a sudden enemy ambush. Here in the dense jungles of Vietnam, throwing oneself onto the ground was a terrifying gamble, as the soil might easily conceal an upward-facing bed of poisoned bamboo spikes. The basic infantry instinct to take cover was cruelly subverted, leaving us feeling completely exposed and vulnerable from all directions. The olfactory landscape of the jungle was just as disorienting, presenting a constant mixture of blooming flora and decaying organic matter. Sometimes, a subtle scent would drift through the humid air, carrying the faint tang of old blood or the pungent odor of human excrement. We quickly learned that these foul smells were often deliberate indicators of hidden danger, as local guerrilla fighters regularly coated their punji sticks with natural toxins or fecal matter. This crude biological warfare tactic was designed to guarantee severe bacterial infections, turning a minor puncture wound into a life-threatening medical emergency. As the afternoon wore on, the thick canopy above us began to block out the diminishing sunlight, casting the jungle floor into deep, ominous twilight. The impending darkness exponentially increased our anxiety, as navigating the treacherous terrain would soon become entirely dependent on touch and blind luck. I commanded the squad to establish a temporary defensive perimeter for the night, selecting a slight elevation that offered a limited but vital vantage point over the surrounding vegetation. The men immediately began digging shallow fighting positions, their entrenching tools scraping cautiously against the dense, root-choked earth. Nightfall in the jungle was a truly terrifying experience, as the oppressive darkness amplified every rustling leaf and snapping twig into a potential enemy assault. We sat in our shallow foxholes, strictly forbidden from lighting cigarettes or using flashlights, completely enveloped in a suffocating blackness that played tricks on our vision. It was during these long, silent hours that the psychological weight of the unseen punji traps truly took hold of my men. The young soldiers like Davis stared into the void, imagining sharpened bamboo stakes rising from the ground to impale them in the dark. I sat quietly in the dark, clutching my modern assault rifle and reflecting on the profound absurdity of our current tactical predicament in this war. We possessed the ability to call in devastating airstrikes, capable of leveling entire mountainsides within minutes, utilizing the most advanced targeting systems in human history. Yet, despite our overwhelming technological superiority, our forward momentum was completely halted by primitive sticks of sharpened wood buried in the mud by local farmers. The technological gap meant nothing when the enemy successfully turned the ancient, natural environment into a lethal and unpredictable weapon against us. When dawn finally broke, it brought no real comfort, only a gray, misty light that barely penetrated the thick canopy and illuminated the exhaustion on our faces. We packed our damp gear in complete silence, our muscles stiff and aching from a sleepless night spent shivering on the damp, unforgiving jungle floor. I ordered the squad to form up, strictly reminding everyone to maintain absolute visual focus on the ground and to step exactly where the point man stepped. The patrol had to continue. Despite the overwhelming dread that settled heavily in the pit of every soldier's stomach. As we moved out from our defensive perimeter, the oppressive heat quickly returned, instantly soaking our uniforms in a fresh layer of uncomfortable, sticky sweat. The terrain grew increasingly difficult, featuring steep, muddy embankments and thick clusters of thorny vines that actively resisted our attempts to push forward through the dense vegetation. Every movement required immense physical effort and intense mental calculation, a draining combination that rapidly eroded the combat readiness of even my most experienced infantrymen. We were marching deeper into a deceptive green hell, fully aware that the invisible traps were patiently waiting for our inevitable mistakes. This grueling march through the Iron Triangle was a harsh, undeniable introduction to the brutal realities of asymmetric warfare that would define our deployment. The American war machine, with all its steel, fuel, and explosive power, was forced to a grinding halt by the sheer ingenuity of a determined guerrilla force. We had entered the jungle as confident hunters, completely assured of our ultimate victory, but the hidden bamboo stakes were slowly transforming us into terrified prey. The psychological foundation of my squad was cracking under the pressure, setting the tragic stage for the devastating events that would soon follow. I looked back down the column one last time, making brief eye contact with Private Davis as he trudged heavily through the thick, clinging mud. His youthful face was drawn and pale beneath a thick layer of camouflage paint, his eyes darting frantically at the innocuous piles of dead leaves surrounding the trail. He gripped his weapon with white knuckles, fighting a silent, desperate battle against the paralyzing fear that threatened to consume his rational mind entirely. Little did we know, the theoretical terror of the punji pits was about to become a gruesome, bloody reality for our unit. To truly understand the profound psychological terror that gripped our infantrymen, one must examine the deceptive simplicity of the punji stick itself. It was not a product of advanced industrial engineering, but rather a brutal masterpiece of primitive, localized warfare born from necessity. The Viet Cong fighters utilized the abundant bamboo forests that surrounded their villages, harvesting the strongest stalks to craft these terrifying weapons of area denial. These local materials were entirely invisible to our sophisticated metal detectors, rendering our standard combat engineering sweeps completely useless in the dense, unforgiving brush. The construction process began with meticulously splitting the thick bamboo culms into individual strips of varying lengths and thicknesses. Local guerrilla forces, often including women and elderly villagers, would spend countless hours whittling these green wooden fragments into incredibly sharp, needle-like points. Bamboo possesses a naturally high tensile strength, meaning that a properly angled cut creates an edge capable of slicing through standard military fabric with ease. This rudimentary manufacturing process required immense patience and intimate knowledge of the material, transforming a harmless plant into a highly effective instrument designed to pierce human flesh. Once the desired sharpness was achieved, the guerrilla engineers employed a crucial, ancient technique to enhance the lethality of their wooden stakes. The freshly carved bamboo tips were carefully roasted over low, smoldering fires, a process that rapidly drew out the natural moisture and significantly hardened the organic fibers. This simple heat treatment transformed the pliable green wood into a rigid, carbonized material that rivaled the piercing capability of low-grade industrial steel. A fire-hardened punji stick would not bend or snap easily under the heavy weight of an American combat boot, ensuring maximum structural penetration. The physical trauma of being impaled was only the initial phase of the devastating injury intentionally designed by the Viet Cong strategists. To maximize the tactical effectiveness of these traps, the sharpened tips were deliberately coated with highly infectious biological agents readily available in the rural environment. The most common applications included a foul mixture of animal feces, human excrement, or putrid mud drawn from stagnant, disease-ridden jungle swamps. This crude but highly effective bacteriological warfare guaranteed that even a minor, non-lethal scratch would almost certainly develop into a severe, rapidly spreading systemic infection. The tropical climate of Vietnam, characterized by suffocating humidity and relentless heat, acted as a perfect incubator for these deliberately introduced pathogens. A soldier suffering a punji wound faced the immediate, terrifying prospect of gangrene, tetanus, or overwhelming sepsis if strong antibiotics were not administered quickly. The feces-coated bamboo introduced aggressive bacteria deep into the muscle tissue, creating festering wounds that defied standard field dressing procedures and rapidly deteriorated the victim's health. We quickly learned that surviving the initial puncture was merely the beginning of a prolonged, agonizing battle against microscopic, unseen enemies. The strategic placement of these stakes demonstrated a profound, masterful understanding of human psychology and standard infantry movement patterns. The Viet Cong rarely placed these traps randomly. Instead, they meticulously analyzed our patrol routes, identifying areas where tired soldiers were most likely to seek rest or cover. Punji pits were frequently dug along the logical avenues of approach, neatly camouflaged with a fragile lattice of thin twigs, broad leaves, and indigenous jungle grass. This careful concealment made the traps virtually indistinguishable from the solid forest floor, creating an ever-present aura of lethal unpredictability. The ingenuity of the guerrilla fighters extended far beyond the simple, vertical pit design that haunted our collective nightmares. They engineered a horrifying variety of dynamic mechanisms, including the dreaded bear trap style, where stepping on a hidden pressure plate caused two spiked boards to snap shut instantly. These dynamic traps were specifically designed to strike the lower leg, driving the poison bamboo deeply into the calf muscle and shattering the tibia or fibula. The mechanical violence of these hidden devices inflicted catastrophic lower extremity trauma that frequently resulted in permanent disability or amputation. Another diabolical variation was the whip trap, which utilized the natural elasticity of a bent bamboo sapling concealed near the trail. A nearly invisible tripwire, often fashioned from dark vines or thin fishing line, was strung tightly across the expected path of our infantry column. When a heavy combat boot snagged the wire, the tension was released, sending a spiked bamboo whip swinging violently at chest or face level. This sudden, kinetic strike caused horrific facial lacerations and severe ocular injuries, instantly removing a soldier from the fight and inducing immediate panic within the squad. The fundamental philosophy driving this extensive deployment of primitive traps represented a stark departure from traditional Western military doctrines of annihilation. The Viet Cong understood that killing an American soldier outright achieved a singular, isolated objective that minimally disrupted the broader operational tempo. Conversely, severely wounding an infantryman generated a cascading series of logistical and psychological crises that crippled the entire combat unit simultaneously. A screaming, bleeding soldier instantly halted the patrol, forcing the commander to shift his focus from aggressive pursuit to immediate, desperate medical preservation and complex casualty evacuation procedures. In the dense, unforgiving terrain of the Iron Triangle, a single wounded man became an unbearable logistical anchor for a small infantry squad. It required at least 2, and often 4, healthy soldiers to carry a makeshift stretcher through the thick undergrowth and treacherous mud. This sudden reallocation of manpower effectively neutralized half of our available firepower, leaving the remaining men highly vulnerable to a coordinated, secondary ambush. The guerrilla fighters routinely exploited this vulnerability, waiting for us to cluster around our fallen comrade before unleashing a devastating volley of automatic weapons fire. The process of extracting a casualty from the deep jungle canopy was a nightmare of complex coordination and extreme physical exertion. Helicopters, our primary method of medical evacuation, simply could not land in the dense, towering vegetation that characterized our operational sectors. We were frequently forced to hack out crude landing zones using machetes and explosive charges while simultaneously defending against intermittent sniper fire. This time-consuming endeavor depleted our limited ammunition reserves, exhausted our physical strength, and exposed the hovering aircraft to the very real threat of shoulder-fired rockets or heavy machine guns. The psychological toll of hearing a fellow soldier scream in sudden, agonizing pain from a hidden trap cannot be adequately quantified. That visceral sound shattered our fragile sense of security, replacing our aggressive combat posture with a paralyzing, suffocating wave of collective anxiety. I remember watching Private Davis flinch at every unexpected noise, his youthful face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated dread as we marched. The sheer randomness of the punji stick attacks meant that survival felt less like a product of superior training and more like a cruel, arbitrary lottery. The continuous threat of these subsurface hazards successfully dictated the pace and tempo of our entire military campaign in the region. A fully equipped American infantry company, capable of marching 20 miles a day on open terrain, was frequently reduced to crawling a few hundred meters per hour. This glacial pace allowed the highly mobile Viet Cong units to dictate the terms of engagement, easily breaking contact and slipping away into the shadows whenever they desired. Our massive logistical superiority was entirely negated by an enemy who wielded the very earth as a weapon. During a brief halt, I pulled Private Davis aside, noticing how his hands shook violently as he tried to open his canteen. "Listen to me, Davis," I commanded softly, ensuring the rest of the exhausted men could not hear the tremor of concern in my voice. "You have to look past the top layer of leaves. Search for slight depressions in the soil, unnatural color variations, or broken twigs that seem deliberately placed." Davis swallowed hard, wiping grime from his eyes, and replied, "Sergeant, it all just looks like dirt and death to me right now." We attempted to counter these primitive threats with our sophisticated military technology, but the results were consistently and frustratingly inadequate. Standard mine detectors, designed to locate buried metallic casings of conventional explosives, remained completely silent when swept over a densely packed pit of wooden spikes. The heavy steel-shanked combat boots rushed into production by the Quartermaster Corps offered some limited protection, but they were exceptionally heavy and notoriously uncomfortable in the sweltering heat. The guerrilla fighters simply adapted, digging their pits deeper or angling the poison stakes to strike the softer upper fabric of the boot. The most significant victory achieved by the punji stick was not measured in the number of American casualties it directly inflicted. Its true success lay in the complete demoralization of the United States infantryman who was forced to constantly battle his own escalating paranoia. The environment itself became our primary antagonist, a silent, pervasive enemy that watched our every move and punished our slightest miscalculations with ruthless efficiency. The Viet Cong had brilliantly transformed our tactical aggressiveness into a crippling liability, forcing us to constantly look down instead of scanning the horizon for the enemy. As a squad leader, the burden of navigating this psychological minefield weighed heavily on my conscience during every single patrol. I was responsible for the lives of young men like Davis, yet I possessed no reliable method to guarantee their safe passage through the treacherous brush. Ordering my men to march forward into suspected trap zones felt like a betrayal of their trust, a cruel gamble with their physical and mental well-being. The command structure demanded aggressive forward progress, but the brutal reality of the jungle floor demanded extreme, time-consuming caution that frustrated our commanding officers. The sheer mental stamina required to maintain this level of hypervigilance was completely unsustainable over the course of a long combat deployment. Soldiers would eventually succumb to exhaustion, their concentration slipping for a fatal fraction of a second, which was all the jungle needed. The tragic irony was that our heavily armed, technologically superior force was being slowly dismantled by weapons that technically belonged in the Stone Age. We were fighting a sophisticated, asymmetric war against an enemy who understood that fear and fatigue were far more effective killers than traditional artillery shells. As our patrol resumed its slow, agonizing crawl through the dense undergrowth, the suffocating atmosphere of the Iron Triangle seemed to grow even heavier. The silent threat of the hidden bamboo stakes had completely saturated our collective consciousness, leaving every man in the column highly irritable and prone to sudden panic. Private Davis was visibly struggling to maintain his composure, his clumsy footsteps growing increasingly erratic as he desperately tried to scan every inch of the path. The theoretical knowledge of the guerrilla traps was about to violently intersect with the brutal, unforgiving physical reality. The terror was not strictly limited to dry land, as the Viet Cong frequently incorporated punji traps into the extensive network of shallow streams and rice paddies. Wading through knee-deep, murky water was already a grueling physical task, but the hidden threat of submerged, feces-coated spikes turned every crossing into a nightmare. These aquatic traps were impossible to detect visually, forcing our soldiers to probe the muddy bottom blindly with heavy sticks before committing to a step. The cold, dirty water offered perfect concealment for the hardened bamboo, transforming routine water crossings into high-stakes gambles. We also discovered that the defensive perimeters surrounding suspected Viet Cong sympathizer villages were heavily fortified with these primitive, concealed weapon systems. A seemingly innocent hedgerow or a slight depression near a civilian dwelling often masked a complex network of interlocking punji pits and deadfall traps. This deliberate integration of civilian infrastructure with lethal guerrilla defenses severely complicated our search and destroy missions, as any aggressive movement could trigger a deadly snare. We were forced to treat every village not as a neutral civilian settlement, but as a carefully constructed, highly lethal military fortification. The cumulative effect of these localized defensive networks was a profound, deeply ingrained sense of helplessness that permeated the entire infantry platoon. We were heavily armed ghosts wandering aimlessly through an ancient, hostile landscape that actively rejected our presence with every agonizingly slow step we took. The simplistic brilliance of the hardened bamboo spike had successfully leveled the battlefield, proving that supreme technological dominance could be utterly defeated by relentless psychological pressure. As we marched deeper into the green abyss, the true, horrifying cost of this asymmetric war was finally beginning to reveal itself. The afternoon sun was completely obliterated by the thick canopy overhead, plunging our patrol into a claustrophobic, green-tinted twilight that distorted every shadow. The jungle air grew heavy and stagnant, clinging to our skin like a damp woolen blanket that made drawing a full breath incredibly difficult. The eerie silence returned, far more profound and unsettling than before, pressing against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. We were moving through a suspected transit corridor in the Iron Triangle, and the absolute lack of wildlife activity signaled an imminent, unseen danger lurking nearby. Our squad advanced at a tortuously slow pace, maintaining a staggered column formation while keeping our eyes glued to the deceptive forest floor. The point man, a seasoned corporal named Jenkins, swept his bayonet back and forth over a pile of rotting vegetation, his movements deliberate and painstakingly methodical. I signaled for the men to close the gap slightly, wanting to maintain visual contact in the dimming light without bunching up into an easy target. Private Davis was trudging behind me, his erratic breathing a clear indicator of his rapidly deteriorating mental and physical stamina. The trail we were following was barely visible, a faint indentation in the undergrowth that snaked around massive, moss-covered tree trunks and dense bamboo thickets. We knew these narrow pathways were specifically targeted by the Viet Cong for their hidden snares, but hacking a fresh path through the virgin jungle was a noisy, exhausting impossibility. I continuously scanned the flanks, gripping my rifle tightly as I searched for the subtle glint of a tripwire or the unnatural alignment of foliage. Every rustling leaf sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my highly sensitized nervous system. We reached a slight bottleneck in the terrain where the trail squeezed tightly between a sheer earthen bank and an impenetrable wall of thorny vines. This was a textbook location for an ambush or a complex trap network, forcing our column to compress and restrict our lateral movement options completely. I raised my fist to halt the patrol, intending to send a flanker up the embankment to secure a desperately needed vantage point over the claustrophobic path. "Keep your eyes down and your weapons ready," I whispered harshly to Davis, whose face was completely drained of all color. Before I could fully deploy the flanking element, a sudden, deafening crack of a breaking branch echoed sharply through the unnervingly quiet jungle atmosphere. The sound was instantly followed by a sickening, muffled thud and a high-pitched scream of absolute agony that paralyzed my heart in my chest. I spun around, my rifle instantly raised, only to see that Private Davis had vanished entirely from his position in the middle of our patrol column. A gaping, dark hole had suddenly appeared just inches off the main trail, partially covered by disturbed leaves and a broken lattice of thin twigs. The horrific realization hit me like a physical blow as Davis's frantic, guttural shrieks tore through the oppressive silence of the deep jungle canopy. He had taken a single, fateful misstep off the compacted dirt of the trail, plunging his full body weight into a deeply concealed punji pit. "Medic! We need the medic up here immediately," I roared, completely abandoning operational stealth as I rushed toward the ragged edge of the newly exposed trap. My hands shook violently as I peered down into the gloomy depths, terrified of the gruesome, bloody trauma I was about to witness. Looking into the pit, the horrific ingenuity of the Viet Cong defensive strategy was laid bare in a horrifying, visceral display of primitive violence. Davis was wedged tightly at the bottom of a narrow, 3-foot-deep trench, his heavy combat gear pinning him awkwardly against the earthen walls. 2 fire-hardened bamboo stakes, thick as a man's wrist and smeared with a foul-smelling brown paste, had cleanly pierced straight through his lower right leg. The sharpened points had completely shattered his calf muscle, exiting through the front of his uniform trousers in a horrific, blood-soaked protrusion of splintered wood. Davis was thrashing wildly in his entrapment, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror as his hands clawed desperately at the slippery, muddy walls surrounding him. "Sergeant, help me! Oh God, it burns. Pull me out!" he screamed hysterically, his voice cracking violently under the immense weight of the agonizing pain. His frantic movements were causing the embedded bamboo stakes to tear further into his flesh, exacerbating the massive tissue damage and accelerating his severe blood loss. "Stop moving, Davis! You are making it worse! Just freeze!" I shouted aggressively, trying to break through his shock-induced panic. The squad medic, Doc Harrison, finally pushed his way to the front of the line, his medical bag clanking heavily against his protective flak jacket. He took one look into the gruesome pit and cursed loudly, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking under the brutal reality of the primitive bamboo weapon. "The stakes are angled downward, Sergeant. We cannot simply pull him straight up without ripping his entire leg apart," Harrison stated grimly, assessing the mechanical trap. The horrific design was explicitly intended to lock the victim firmly in place, turning a rescue attempt into a dangerous surgical extraction. The smell rising from the pit was absolutely nauseating, a pungent mixture of freshly turned earth, metallic blood, and the distinct, sickening odor of human feces. The guerrilla fighters had heavily coated these specific punji sticks with highly toxic excrement, virtually guaranteeing a massive, potentially fatal bacterial infection deep within the wound. Doc Harrison quickly began organizing the complex extraction, ordering 2 burly infantrymen to carefully lower themselves into the confined space to support Davis's dead weight. We had to lift him precisely parallel to the angle of the stakes to prevent catastrophic arterial tearing during the removal. Every second that ticked by felt like an agonizing eternity as the squad desperately worked to secure our screaming, violently trembling comrade in the mud. We were highly exposed, clustered tightly together around the pit, and making enough noise to alert any Viet Cong patrols within a 2-mile radius. I immediately ordered the remaining men to establish a tight, outward-facing defensive perimeter, fully expecting an opportunistic enemy ambush to exploit our sudden, chaotic vulnerability. The dense undergrowth offered no real cover, leaving us incredibly exposed as we focused entirely on freeing the trapped young soldier from his wooden prison. "On 3, lift him slowly, follow the angle of the wood," Doc Harrison commanded, his hands covered in Davis's blood as he guided the men. The physical exertion required to carefully hoist a fully equipped, thrashing soldier out of a muddy hole was immense, draining our already depleted energy reserves. Davis let out a final, ear-piercing shriek of absolute torture as his body cleared the sharp tips of the bamboo, mercifully passing out from the intense pain. We hauled his limp, heavy body onto the solid trail, immediately laying him flat as Harrison tore into his medical supplies. The sheer extent of the physical trauma was horrifying to behold in the dim, green light filtering through the dense canopy of the iron triangle. The bamboo had completely pulverized the major muscle groups in his calf, leaving two gaping, ragged puncture wounds that oozed a mixture of dark blood and dirt. Harrison worked frantically, applying thick pressure dressings and injecting a massive dose of morphine into Davis's thigh to combat the severe, life-threatening physiological shock. "This is heavily contaminated, Sergeant. We need immediate medevac or he is going to lose this leg to gangrene by tomorrow," Harrison warned. The tactical reality of our situation crashed down upon me with crushing, suffocating weight as I stared up at the impenetrable, multi-layered roof of the jungle. There was absolutely no way a medical evacuation helicopter could penetrate this dense foliage, and we were miles away from the nearest secure clearing. We were carrying a critically wounded, deeply infected soldier, and our mobility had just been reduced to a literal, exhausting crawl through hostile, booby-trapped territory. The Viet Cong strategy had worked flawlessly, crippling my squad and forcing me to make impossible decisions regarding the survival of my men. I quickly radioed our company commander, desperately requesting an emergency extraction, but the heavy static interference of the deep jungle completely fragmented our critical transmission. The radio operator shook his head grimly, confirming that we were essentially isolated and entirely on our own until we could reach higher, more open ground. "We have to carry him. Rig a poncho litter right now," I ordered, my voice tight with a mixture of suppressed rage and escalating anxiety. 4 men reluctantly stepped forward, fully aware that carrying the heavy stretcher would leave them completely defenseless against any sudden, violent enemy contact. Constructing the makeshift stretcher took precious minutes that we simply did not have, further exposing our static position to potential guerrilla scouts monitoring the area. We utilized 2 sturdy rifles and a heavy canvas poncho, carefully shifting Davis's unconscious, bleeding body onto the improvised litter with extreme, deliberate caution. The foul odor of the feces-tainted wound was already becoming overpowering, a grim reminder of the aggressive bacterial infection rapidly spreading through his young bloodstream. I looked at the exhausted, terrified faces of my men and realized our psychological cohesion was rapidly disintegrating under the immense pressure of the unseen. Lifting the heavy stretcher required a massive, coordinated effort that immediately strained the weary backs and burning leg muscles of the 4 designated carriers. The narrow, winding trail was completely unsuitable for a rigid litter, forcing the men to stumble awkwardly through thorny bushes and deep, slippery mud puddles. Every sudden jolt or loss of balance elicited a weak, agonizing groan from Davis, whose pale face was covered in a thick sheen of cold, clammy sweat. Our rate of march slowed to an agonizing crawl, our tactical advantage completely erased by the primitive bamboo stakes buried in the earth. The psychological atmosphere within the squad transformed from tense alertness to a state of near-paralyzing, suffocating paranoia as we resumed our desperate forward movement. Every man was acutely aware that the ground beneath their boots was a highly deceptive, lethal minefield, just waiting to claim another horrific casualty. The point man's progress became excruciatingly slow, his bayonet probing every single fallen leaf and muddy puddle with an almost obsessive, terrified level of meticulous detail. The invisible enemy had successfully implanted a profound psychological terror that proved far more effective than any conventional artillery barrage or direct infantry assault could achieve. We managed to cover barely 300 meters over the next grueling hour, an incredibly pathetic distance that severely compromised our overall operational security. The sun was rapidly setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the jungle floor that easily concealed any further rudimentary traps placed along our designated route. Davis was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and rapid, as the severe systemic infection began to ravage his weakened, traumatized body. Doc Harrison continually checked his fading pulse, his grim expression confirming my deepest fears regarding our desperate, terrifying isolation in this unforgiving wilderness. As darkness finally consumed the iron triangle, we were forced to halt our movement completely, entirely unable to navigate the treacherous, trap-laden terrain without light. We established a hasty, incredibly vulnerable defensive perimeter in a small depression, placing the stretcher securely in the center while the men dug shallow fighting positions. The oppressive, terrifying blackness of the jungle night descended upon us, amplifying the agonizing moans of our wounded comrade and heightening our collective, suffocating dread. We sat completely motionless in the mud, silently praying that the dawn would arrive before the unseen enemy decided to strike our crippled unit. I spent the entire night kneeling beside Davis, wiping the burning fever sweat from his forehead while tightly clutching my loaded rifle in the dark. The smell of the contaminated wound was horrific, a constant, sickening reminder of the primitive brutality that had successfully neutralized our advanced military superiority. I listened to the terrified, erratic breathing of my young soldiers in the surrounding darkness, knowing their minds were plagued by visions of sharpened, poisoned bamboo. The physical trap had sprung, but the true psychological trauma of the punji stick was only just beginning to take root within us. We were trapped in a profound nightmare of asymmetrical warfare, defeated not by bullets or bombs, but by the very earth of the hostile country. The simple, brutal effectiveness of the hidden stake had completely shattered our confidence, leaving us feeling entirely powerless and vulnerable against a phantom adversary. I stared into the impenetrable blackness, realizing that even if we managed to survive this patrol, the terrifying memory of the hidden trap would endure forever. Our innocence and technological arrogance had been violently stripped away, violently replaced by a permanent, haunting fear of the ground beneath our trembling feet. The morning light struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting a sickening, pale gray hue over our makeshift defensive perimeter. The harrowing night had finally ended, but the psychological damage inflicted upon my men was permanently etched into their exhausted, hollow faces. Private Davis was barely clinging to life, his fever spiking violently as the aggressive infection from the feces-coated bamboo ravaged his weakened bloodstream. We were completely isolated in the hostile heart of the Iron Triangle, heavily burdened by a critically wounded comrade and surrounded by an invisible, terrifying enemy that patiently awaited our next move. I grabbed the heavy radio handset, desperately trying to establish a stable communication link with our battalion command post to arrange an immediate medical evacuation. The dense foliage and atmospheric interference reduced the vital transmission to a frustrating, incomprehensible wall of violent static. Command, this is Miller. We have an urgent priority casualty requiring immediate extraction. Over. I repeated endlessly into the dead microphone, receiving absolutely nothing but white noise in return. The grim reality settled heavily upon my shoulders. No helicopter was coming to save us, and we would have to carry Davis through the booby-trapped nightmare ourselves. Looking around at the surviving members of my squad, I witnessed the complete, devastating collapse of American military morale in real time. The young, fiercely confident infantrymen who had marched into this jungle just days ago were now entirely consumed by a paralyzing, suffocating wave of intense paranoia. They no longer scanned the surrounding tree lines for enemy snipers or incoming ambushes. Instead, their wide, terrified eyes were rigidly locked onto the damp soil beneath their heavy boots. The earth itself had maliciously transformed into our primary antagonist, a silent predator armed with poisoned, sharpened bamboo stakes. We hastily prepared to resume our grueling march, awkwardly lifting the heavy, blood-soaked poncho litter carrying Davis's feverish, violently trembling body. The 4 designated stretcher-bearers groaned under the immense physical strain, their exhausted muscles trembling as they struggled to maintain a stable, coordinated footing in the treacherous mud. Appointing a new point man to lead our column became an incredibly difficult, morally agonizing command decision, as absolute terror had completely infected every single soldier. Nobody wanted to be the first man to test the highly deceptive, potentially lethal ground that stretched endlessly out before us in the gloomy twilight. Corporal Jenkins reluctantly resumed his position at the absolute front of the patrol, his previously confident, methodical movements now replaced by a frantic, visibly shaking hesitation. He aggressively probed every single fallen leaf, every shallow mud puddle, and every slightly discolored patch of dirt with his bayonet, sweating profusely despite the relatively cool morning air. His agonizingly slow pace was technically necessary for our physical survival, but it drastically increased our exposure to potential enemy ambushes and completely destroyed our tactical momentum. We were essentially crawling through the hostile jungle, entirely neutralized by the psychological threat of the unseen. The ambient sounds of the dense tropical forest, previously ignored as mere background noise, now served as continuous, terrifying triggers for our heavily traumatized nervous systems. A sudden gust of wind rustling the upper canopy sounded exactly like the violent snapping of a concealed tripwire, causing the entire squad to instinctively freeze in absolute, breathless panic. A small rodent scurrying rapidly through the dry underbrush, mimicking the deadly release mechanism of a mechanical whip trap, sent a powerful jolt of pure adrenaline straight into my veins. We were fighting a terrifying ghost that existed entirely within our own deeply fractured minds. Private Davis periodically slipped back into agonizing consciousness, his weak, delirious moans echoing softly through the claustrophobic, green-tinted corridors of the deep jungle. Doc Harrison walked closely beside the improvised stretcher, constantly checking the heavily soiled pressure bandages, his face a grim mask of absolute, professional despair. The putrid, rotting stench emanating from the infected puncture wounds was absolutely overpowering, a constant, sickening reminder of the primitive biological warfare actively destroying the young soldier's leg. Harrison quietly whispered to me that without intravenous antibiotics and immediate surgical intervention, the aggressive gangrene would inevitably claim Davis's life before nightfall. About 2 hours into our torturously slow advance, the intense psychological pressure finally broke one of my youngest, most inexperienced riflemen completely. Private Henderson abruptly stopped dead in his tracks, dropping his heavy weapon into the thick mud and violently refusing to take another single step forward. "I cannot do it anymore, Sergeant. The entire ground is hollow. They are waiting right underneath us," he babbled hysterically, tears streaming rapidly down his pale, dirt-streaked face. The severe mental strain of hypervigilance had completely shattered his rational mind, leaving him utterly paralyzed by the terrifying illusion of infinite, hidden punji pits. I quickly rushed over to Henderson, grabbing him forcefully by his tactical webbing and violently shaking him to break his dangerous, escalating hysterical episode. "Listen to me, soldier. Pick up your damn rifle right now and focus on the boots of the man directly in front of you," I hissed fiercely through clenched teeth, desperately trying to keep my voice low. I knew that his sudden panic attack was highly contagious and could easily trigger a massive, uncontrollable psychological collapse throughout the entire exhausted squad. We were walking on a razor's edge between basic military discipline and total catastrophic madness. Henderson shakily retrieved his muddy rifle, his chest heaving violently as he swallowed his sobs, but his combat effectiveness was now completely, undeniably gone. He walked like a rigid, terrified automaton, his wide eyes blindly staring straight ahead, entirely incapable of providing any reliable security for our vulnerable flanks. Our overall combat formation was a disorganized, sluggish mess, heavily weighed down by physical exhaustion, carrying a dying man, and deeply infected by overwhelming psychological terror. The Viet Cong did not even need to fire a single bullet to completely destroy my squad. Their primitive bamboo stakes had already accomplished the mission. Suddenly, Corporal Jenkins violently threw up his clenched fist, instantly halting the sluggish column as he slowly dropped to his knees, staring intently at the ground. He carefully used the tip of his combat knife to gently brush away a perfectly natural-looking arrangement of broad, green leaves spanning the narrow, muddy trail. Beneath the deceptive camouflage lay a massive, rectangular pit, heavily lined with dozens of freshly sharpened, fire-hardened bamboo spikes, aggressively pointing upward toward the surface. We had stopped merely 3 inches away from stepping directly into a horrific, multi-casualty disaster that would have completely annihilated the entire squad. The terrifying discovery of this massive, carefully concealed trap heavily reinforced our deepest, darkest fears, proving definitively that our crippling paranoia was completely, absolutely justified. The guerrilla engineers had deliberately constructed this specific deadfall pit directly on the only viable path through a dense thicket of impenetrable, thorny vines. We were forced to spend a grueling, nerve-wracking 30 minutes carefully bypassing the lethal obstacle, nervously inching sideways through the thick brush while carrying the heavy stretcher. Every single movement was a terrifying, high-stakes gamble with our lives, heavily dictated by an enemy who remained entirely invisible and securely hidden. It became chillingly apparent that we were no longer fighting a conventional army composed of human soldiers wielding modern, mass-produced firearms and artillery. We were engaged in a desperate, deeply traumatizing battle against the hostile terrain itself, a vicious landscape that had been meticulously weaponized by a highly resourceful enemy. Our superior training in advanced squad tactics, flanking maneuvers, and synchronized suppressing fire was completely useless against a sharp stick buried silently in the damp earth. The fundamental rules of modern warfare had been violently rewritten by local farmers, rendering the mighty American military machine entirely impotent and incredibly vulnerable. The severe physical exhaustion heavily compounded our profound psychological terror as the oppressive heat and suffocating humidity rapidly drained our violently trembling bodies of vital fluids. Our heavy combat boots felt like massive lead weights, and the thick canvas straps of our heavy backpacks ruthlessly dug deep into our aching, blistered shoulders. Staying sharply alert required massive amounts of cognitive energy that we simply did not possess anymore, causing our visual focus to blur dangerously in the dim light. We were highly susceptible to fatal mistakes, slowly stumbling forward like exhausted zombies waiting for the inevitable, violent snap of a bamboo trap. Our shattered nerves were violently tested again when a large, startled jungle bird suddenly exploded from the thick undergrowth right beside our heavily strained column. 3 traumatized soldiers instantly dropped to the muddy ground in absolute terror, wildly pointing their heavy automatic weapons into the empty, rapidly swaying green bushes. The sheer, unadulterated panic in their wide eyes was deeply heartbreaking. They were completely prepared to unleash a massive wall of lead at absolutely nothing. This terrifying false alarm perfectly illustrated the extreme, debilitating level of psychological hoariness that had firmly taken root deep within our fractured minds. Private Davis suddenly began thrashing violently on the makeshift poncho litter, his severe, infection-induced fever heavily driving his fragile mind into a state of terrifying, dark delirium. "They are underneath the floorboards, Sergeant. They are stabbing upward through the damn floor," he screamed hysterically, his bloodshot eyes frantically searching the thick jungle canopy. Doc Harrison desperately pinned his shaking shoulders down, quickly administering another highly dangerous dose of morphine just to keep the critically wounded soldier relatively quiet. The heartbreaking sight of his severe suffering deeply demoralized the surviving men, completely draining whatever tiny fraction of fighting spirit remained. I walked mechanically forward, my mind heavily burdened by the profound, tragic absurdity of our current tactical situation in this sprawling, endless green hell. The United States government had spent billions of dollars developing advanced jet fighters, heavy tanks, and incredibly sophisticated radar systems to combat the spread of global communism. Yet, here we were, a heavily armed infantry squad violently paralyzed and completely defeated by sharpened wooden sticks generously coated in foul, infectious animal excrement. The massive technological gap meant absolutely nothing when an indigenous guerrilla force successfully manipulated human psychology and heavily weaponized the natural environment against us. According to my heavily sweat-stained topographical map, we were finally approaching a small, natural clearing that might possibly serve as a viable helicopter extraction point. However, this tiny glimmer of hope was immediately overshadowed by the terrifying tactical reality that open areas were notoriously utilized as heavily fortified ambush kill zones. The Viet Cong purposely funneled desperately wounded American units toward these exact clearings, patiently waiting with hidden machine guns perfectly zeroed in on the exposed ground. We had to carefully navigate the treacherous tree line, highly suspicious of every single blade of grass that bordered the open sunlight. We agonizingly crawled to the very edge of the dense vegetation, slowly establishing a highly concealed defensive perimeter while desperately scanning the eerily quiet, sunlit clearing. The stretcher bearers gently lowered Davis to the muddy ground, their chests heaving violently as they completely collapsed into the thick undergrowth, utterly physically and mentally destroyed. I grabbed the heavy radio handset one final time, praying that our slightly elevated position and thinner canopy cover would finally allow a clear, vital transmission. The terrifying psychological ordeal of the endless punji traps had fundamentally broken our spirits, leaving us desperately begging for a noisy, airborne salvation. A sudden, sharp burst of heavy static violently crackled through the radio handset, followed by the incredibly beautiful, clear voice of a distant American aviation operator. "Dust off actual. This is command. We receive your emergency medical extraction request. Loud and clear. Pop green smoke to mark your current landing zone. Over." A massive, collective sigh of overwhelming relief instantly rippled through the deeply traumatized squad as the heavy burden of absolute despair briefly lifted from our exhausted shoulders. We had miraculously survived the horrific, booby-trapped gauntlet, but the psychological scars inflicted by the primitive bamboo stakes would permanently endure. I aggressively pulled the metal pin on a heavy smoke grenade, tossing the cylindrical canister directly into the center of the bright, open jungle clearing. A thick, violently expanding cloud of vibrant green smoke rapidly billowed upward, completely piercing the gloomy atmospheric haze and clearly marking our desperate, vulnerable position. We waited in absolute terrifying silence, our heavy weapons firmly pointed outward, fully expecting the hidden guerrilla fighters to launch a sudden, violent assault before the helicopter arrived. Every passing second felt like a grueling, agonizing eternity as we intensely stared into the dense, highly suspicious tree line surrounding us. The distant, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades finally began to echo softly across the vast jungle canopy, gradually growing into a massive, deafening mechanical roar. The beautiful, olive-drab medical evacuation helicopter aggressively flared right above the bright green smoke, violently whipping the surrounding trees and tall grass into a chaotic frenzy. The sudden influx of modern, overwhelming technological noise temporarily shattered the oppressive, primitive silence that had deeply haunted our terrifying, agonizing journey through the Iron Triangle. We hastily grabbed the bloody poncho litter, desperately rushing toward the violently swirling winds and absolute safety of the hovering aircraft. Doc Harrison and the exhausted stretcher-bearers violently shoved the heavily bleeding, completely unconscious Private Davis onto the cold metal floor of the waiting medical helicopter. The dedicated flight medic immediately began administering vital intravenous fluids and powerful, life-saving antibiotics, frantically working to stabilize the critically wounded soldier before rapid takeoff. I quickly directed the remaining deeply traumatized members of my squad to climb aboard, watching their highly terrified, dirt-streaked faces visibly relax as they left the muddy earth. We were finally escaping the horrific, unseen enemy, but the terrifying memory of the hidden ground would relentlessly follow us home. As the heavy helicopter violently pitched forward and rapidly ascended above the sprawling, endless canopy of the Iron Triangle, I stared blankly down at the dense jungle. From this highly elevated, incredibly safe vantage point, the vast green wilderness looked completely peaceful, entirely hiding the horrific, primitive nightmare of sharpened wooden stakes below. My surviving men sat in complete, stunned silence, deeply traumatized by the terrifying realization that the earth itself had maliciously tried to brutally murder them. The extreme psychological paranoia heavily implanted by the simple punji stick had successfully achieved its dark, highly devastating military objective against us. The deafening roar of the medical evacuation helicopter provided a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the dense jungle we had just escaped. Sitting on the vibrating metal floor, I watched the dedicated flight medics working frantically to stabilize Private Davis amidst a tangle of intravenous tubes. His pale, lifeless face was covered in a thick layer of cold sweat, and his breathing remained dangerously shallow. The primitive biological warfare engineered by the guerrilla fighters had successfully brought a fully equipped American infantryman to the absolute brink of death. Our flight back to the main forward operating base was shrouded in a heavy, deeply traumatized silence that permeated the entire surviving squad. The young soldiers who had eagerly marched into the Iron Triangle just days ago were now completely hollowed out, their eyes locked in vacant thousand-yard stares. The terrifying psychological dominance of the hidden punji traps had fundamentally broken their fighting spirit and shattered their arrogant illusions of invincibility. We had technically survived the brutal patrol, but a significant part of our humanity was left buried in that mud. Upon arriving at the heavily fortified military hospital, Davis was immediately rushed into an emergency surgical unit by a team of frantic doctors. Doc Harrison and I stood helplessly in the sterile, brightly lit corridor, our muddy, blood-stained uniforms drawing sharp looks from the clean medical staff passing by. The overwhelming stench of the heavily infected puncture wounds seemed to cling permanently to our skin, a sickening olfactory reminder of the dark jungle floor. We waited anxiously for hours, praying that modern medicine could somehow reverse the primitive, devastating tissue damage. A weary surgeon finally emerged from the operating theater, his surgical scrubs completely covered in dark blood, delivering the tragic, inevitable news we deeply feared. The bacterial infection from the feces-coated bamboo was simply too aggressive, spreading rapidly through the necrotic muscle tissue, the doctor explained with a heavy, defeated sigh. To save the young soldier's life from overwhelming, fatal sepsis, they were forced to completely amputate his right leg entirely above the shattered knee. A primitive wooden stick had permanently crippled a strong American youth in a matter of seconds. The devastating realization of Davis's permanent disability sent a profound shockwave of bitter anger and deep sorrow through the remaining members of our squad. We had crossed an ocean armed with the most sophisticated weaponry ever created, yet we were systematically dismantled by sharpened agricultural tools buried in dirt. This stark technological paradox highlighted the utter absurdity of our tactical approach to this deeply complex, highly localized asymmetric conflict in Southeast Asia. The guerrilla fighters had flawlessly turned their poverty and limited resources into a terrifyingly effective military advantage. This painful historical lesson forced the United States military command to completely reevaluate and drastically alter its fundamental infantry patrol doctrines across the entire country. Quartermasters rushed millions of reinforced combat boots into production, featuring heavy steel plates rigidly embedded within the soles to prevent upward bamboo penetration. While these specialized boots offered a slight physical barrier against the traps, they were incredibly heavy, extremely uncomfortable, and completely ruined a soldier's stealthy movement. Furthermore, the Viet Cong quickly adapted by simply angling the poisoned stakes to strike the unprotected calf instead. Military strategists also deployed highly trained scout dogs to lead our vulnerable infantry columns through the dense, booby-trapped jungles and treacherous village perimeters. These intelligent animals possessed an incredible olfactory capability, often detecting the faint, unnatural scent of disturbed earth or the specific bodily odors of the hiding guerrillas. The dogs proved exceptionally valuable in identifying the precise locations of hidden tripwires and deeply concealed punji pits before our lead elements could trigger them. However, even the best canine units were ultimately susceptible to fatigue and the overwhelming sensory overload of the jungle. Despite these desperate, large-scale tactical adaptations, the pervasive psychological terror inflicted by the rudimentary bamboo traps could never be fully erased from our collective consciousness. The fundamental trust between a marching infantryman and the solid ground beneath his feet had been violently, permanently severed by the unseen, hostile environment. Every subsequent patrol became an agonizing exercise in extreme mental endurance, heavily burdened by the paralyzing fear of taking a single fatal misstep off the designated trail. The physical wounds might eventually heal, but the crippling paranoia remained firmly entrenched within our minds. The strategic brilliance of the Viet Cong defensive doctrine lay in its incredibly low cost and disproportionately high psychological impact on the invading forces. They understood perfectly that a heavily demoralized, deeply terrified American soldier was essentially a neutralized combatant, regardless of the heavy firepower he carried. By transforming the natural landscape into a vast, terrifying minefield of poisoned stakes, they successfully denied us safe mobility and severely disrupted our operational tempo. Our massive logistical superiority was constantly stalled by invisible wooden barricades that completely defied conventional military destruction methods. Decades after the final American helicopters departed from that deeply traumatized country, the lingering psychological effects of the punji stick still haunt countless combat veterans. Many older men who survived the harrowing patrols of the Iron Triangle still find themselves instinctively scanning the grass while walking through peaceful suburban parks. The terrifying memory of the sudden, agonizing scream followed by the horrific sight of splintered bamboo piercing human flesh is an indelible burning nightmare. It perfectly encapsulates the profound, deeply tragic futility of matching advanced modern technology against a fiercely determined indigenous resistance. I visited William Davis at a stateside veterans hospital several months after his devastating, life-altering medical evacuation from the unforgiving Vietnamese jungle. He sat quietly in a sturdy wheelchair, his youthful face heavily lined with premature aging and a profound, lingering sadness that deeply broke my heart. "I still feel the damp soil giving way beneath my boot, Sergeant. I feel the terrible burning in a leg that does not even exist anymore," he whispered softly. The invisible enemy had followed him thousands of miles home, a permanent phantom residing in his mind. The incredibly cruel ingenuity of those simple bamboo stakes served as a massive, bloody equalizer in a war defined by staggering technological imbalances. We dropped countless tons of highly advanced explosives from the sky, attempting to physically obliterate an enemy we could rarely see or engage directly. In response, they patiently carved pieces of local wood, dipped them in filth, and buried them precisely where they knew our exhausted infantrymen would eventually walk. It was a masterclass in localized guerrilla warfare that successfully neutralized our arrogant, overwhelming reliance on industrial military might. As a seasoned infantry leader, my greatest failure was entirely unavoidable. I simply could not protect my vulnerable men from the malicious, weaponized earth itself. We were thoroughly trained to violently assault fortified hills, heavily suppress enemy bunkers, and coordinate complex artillery strikes against visible, mass troop formations. Nobody ever taught us how to effectively combat a silent, hidden wooden spike, waiting patiently in the dark mud to shatter our bones and spirits. The traditional military textbooks were completely useless in this terrifying, claustrophobic green hell where the ground actively despised our presence. Every single combat veteran who ever walked point through those dense, heavily booby-trapped tropical forests shares a unique, unspoken bond of profound psychological trauma. We all know the excruciating, heart-stopping terror of suddenly feeling a highly unnatural resistance against the front edge of our muddy combat boots. We all vividly remember the suffocating, silent prayers whispered in the dark, desperately begging the universe to let us survive just one more terrifying footstep. The simple act of walking, an incredibly basic human function, was permanently corrupted by the horrific, ever-present threat of the hidden punji trap. Looking back at the historical legacy of that deeply controversial, highly destructive conflict, the rudimentary punji stick remains a powerful, universally recognized symbol of guerrilla resilience. It flawlessly illustrates how a deeply motivated, technologically inferior force can systematically dismantle the operational morale of a massively superior, highly funded invading army. The bamboo stake did not win the war entirely on its own, but it undeniably dictated the agonizing, terrifying pace of the daily ground combat operations. It forced the mighty American military giant to constantly look down in fear instead of confidently marching forward. Ultimately, the true horror of the Punji Pit was never just about the horrific physical trauma or the aggressive, life-threatening bacterial infections it caused. It was about the complete psychological degradation of the individual soldier, slowly eroding his basic sanity through a constant, unrelenting state of extreme hypervigilance. You cannot shoot a hidden hole in the ground, and you cannot aggressively interrogate a sharp piece of wood regarding the location of the enemy forces. The traps generated a deep, suffocating sense of complete helplessness that slowly destroyed our military cohesion from the inside out. The profound impact of these primitive weapons fundamentally altered the entire psychiatric landscape of the surviving American veterans returning from the grueling overseas deployment. The intense, crippling paranoia cultivated by the booby-trapped jungle environment perfectly laid the dark psychological foundation for what we now understand as severe post-traumatic stress. Our brains were permanently hardwired to associate natural foliage and uneven ground with immediate, violent death, making reintegration into peaceful civilian society an incredibly difficult challenge. The war eventually ended, but the terrifying ghosts of the hidden bamboo stakes continued to claim countless casualties back home. I often reflect on the stark contrast between the roaring engines of our million-dollar jet fighters and the quiet, deadly patience of the hidden bamboo trap. History has repeatedly proven that fancy technology and overwhelming firepower are utterly meaningless if the individual infantryman is too terrified to take a single step forward. The Viet Cong perfectly understood this fundamental human vulnerability, mercilessly exploiting our deep psychological fear of the unseen to completely paralyze our massive military machine. They successfully turned the very soil of their homeland into their most effective, reliable, and deeply terrifying soldier. This narrative remains a stark, incredibly vital reminder of the extreme, horrifying realities faced by the young infantrymen who marched into that green abyss. The story of the primitive punji stick is a dark, tragic testament to the devastating effectiveness of asymmetric warfare against an unprepared, arrogant superpower. It proves that human ingenuity and a deep, intimate understanding of the local environment can successfully counter the most advanced, heavily funded military forces on the planet. For those of us who survived, the terrifying memory of the deadly ground will never, ever be truly forgotten. As we conclude this dark historical examination, it is absolutely essential to deeply acknowledge the incredible psychological toll borne by those young, terrified American soldiers. They were thrust into an impossibly hostile environment where traditional military courage meant absolutely nothing against a completely invisible, highly deceptive subsurface threat. The continuous, agonizing anticipation of the trap snapping shut was arguably much worse than the actual physical pain of the sudden, violent wooden impalement. The profound dread generated by those simple bamboo sticks fundamentally reshaped the entire human experience of ground combat during the Long War. Ultimately, the story of the rudimentary punji trap stands as a chilling, highly effective masterclass in the psychological dimensions of modern asymmetric warfare strategy. It serves as a grim warning to future military commanders who might blindly trust advanced technology to quickly solve complex, deeply entrenched, localized conflicts. A determined native force fighting on their own highly familiar terrain will always find incredibly creative, devastating ways to neutralize superior, heavy industrial firepower. The sharpened bamboo stake remains the ultimate terrifying symbol of a deeply humbled superpower forced to completely fear the earth itself.